$5 billion vacation industry. This is the other Florida. 5,000 miles of deserted coast and coastal waterways where boats can hide, plus thousands of square miles of swamps where airplanes can dump their loads. It's a dope smuggler's paradise. One of the dopers' favorite tactics is to fly drugs out of Colombia in large airplanes, then drop the bales at a pre-designated spot in the swamp to be picked up by cohorts on the ground. These customs agents have been staked out in the Everglades for 3 days on information that such a drop is imminent. Just at dusk, the suspect plane appeared and began buzzing the tiny airstrip. In the confusion that followed, the agents managed to secure the people who were waiting on the ground. But the customs airplane lost the suspect aircraft. If any dope was dropped, it was so far out in the swamp that they never found it. No dope, no arrests, weeks of planning plus 3 days and nights with the mosquitoes and the alligators. And all for nothing. It's typical of what has become a war of frustration for law enforcement. It's not that they never make huge seizures of dope. They do. But for every bale of marijuana you see here, perhaps 20 more have gotten through undetected. South Florida is now called the dope smuggling capital of the country. And Regional Customs Commissioner Robert Batard would not disagree.
Last year, 87% of all the seizures of marijuana made throughout the United States were made right in the southeast Florida area. For the first month of this fiscal year, 95% of all the marijuana was seized right here.
Fred Rohde of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, gave us a primer on how the smugglers operate at sea, from Colombia in South America, where most of it originates, to Florida and beyond.
Well, a typical operation would be a mothership off the Colombian coast with, say, 100 tons of marijuana proceeding up these waters and have coordinates where they'll meet vessels, offload vessels coming from the Florida coast and drop off another 20 tons. Then proceed up to Georgia, the Carolinas, New York, and even as far as Maine, where in each place they'll drop off the designated amounts of marijuana that the various organizations involved have ordered.
Just like a beer distributor hitting a string of taverns.
Very similar.
I'd go out and make contact with a mother load and then show special passport deal, and then I'd come back in with a load.
This man talked with Morley Safer several months ago. He ran loads of marijuana from motherships to shore in a small boat, one of the lowest paying jobs.
How much money could you make in a night?
$60,000 to $100,000.
That's just your end of it?
Yeah. Well, this last load I brought in was worth over $1 million.
With all that money around, you'd expect some of the people who were involved. These Colombians were taken off a mothership with 37 tons of marijuana aboard.
The red color shows it's marijuana.
It is definitely marijuana.
These young Americans were caught with a paltry 250 pounds on an airplane. Authorities speculate they were headed for the streets of New York to make a few fast bucks. But then there are people you might not expect.
We've arrested, convicted doctors, lawyers, judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, a mayor of a prominent city, and people from every walk of life.
During one 6-hour period while we were filming in Miami, we learned the following in an oh-by-the-way manner. The Coast Guard seized a pleasure boat with more than 8 tons of marijuana, street value $5 million. DEA confiscated 35 pounds of pure cocaine, worth close to $8 million. And Miami police turned over to Customs $375,000 in cash, picked up in a drug arrest. In fact, one of the biggest problems the smugglers have is what to do with their money. Those starch bankers' eyebrows go up when someone tries to deposit a few $100,000 in dirty bills out of a bag. And so, authorities say, at least 4 banks in the Miami area are owned by the dopers.
20,000. How about 21? 21? How about 22?
And this isn't your everyday auction. The customs people are selling off vessels they've seized, going for a fraction of their original worth because they've been tied up in court cases for so long. The Jubilee 5 here, dusty and dirty and probably beginning to rot after months at the dock, is not untypical. Found abandoned in Fort Lauderdale with 11 tons of marijuana aboard. In fact, the customs people have 150 boats like this in custody, 150 different stories. The Concord, with more than 9 tons aboard, found tied up at a house in Fort Lauderdale. 5 people arrested. And the Grand Hotel, found drifting south of Great Isaac Light. The crew had abandoned ship, leaving aboard 13 tons of marijuana for the feds to burn.
They can buy any size vessel they want. They can pay any amount of money up to $500,000 to $1 million. And in effect, it's overhead. It's no problem to them.
This man has flown several loads of marijuana into Florida for dope smugglers.
I was at a guy's house one time when he got a little bit loaded and decided he was going to count his money. He had about 60 shoeboxes, and he started dumping them on the bed. Made a pile of money about 3 foot high, and they started running off the sides of the bed, you know. Well, he eventually was caught. With the amount of money that he had, he didn't have to worry about going to jail. He got out of it.
Can money keep you out of jail?
Damn right, money can keep you out of jail.
And of course he's right. Anybody who does get caught hires the best lawyers around. Court calendars are clogged. Some prosecutors will tell you privately that any case involving less than 6 tons of marijuana is a nuisance they'd rather not hear about. Some dopers just pay their bail and disappear.
We have some 3,000 fugitives in DEA, people that have no problem putting up $200,000 or $500,000 bail.
That's overhead again?
That's overhead.
The customs people are the ones directly responsible for stopping dope entering the country. And from seeing tractor-trailer loads of it being hauled to an incinerator in convoy, you'd think they were in control of the situation. They're not. The official line is that they're probably stopping about 10% of the traffic. The line officers will say as little as 2%.
It's very difficult. We've got about 5,000 miles of coastline right here in Florida. We're outmanned, out-equipped, and out-financed.
They're frustrated on the water and in the air as well. These airplanes have been seized by customs, mostly with a small fleet of aircraft that patrol the air corridors, hundreds of miles of them, between Colombia and South Florida. In fact, most of the airplanes that don't make it through usually get stopped not by the law, but by bad weather, bad flying, or bad luck, especially in Colombia.
I slid a DC-6 at one time into a mud strip that was built like a dog leg. It was necessary to knock some brush down on one end in order to get into it. And once we got into it, skidded it around the corner, and we were still doing about 80, I guess. We finally got to stop and turn around and loaded the airplane, and then it was a difficult task to get it back out. One sputter and you die, and that's what it amounts to. And they're down there all over the place where they didn't make it. I would say that there's been more than 70 accidents this year.
When you hit Colombia, how long does it take?
The fastest I've ever gone in and loaded and got out was like 17 minutes on the ground. By the time you open the rear doors, the aircraft is being loaded. You never shut the engines down. They'll have probably 30 people on a load crew, and they'll probably have anywhere from 30 to 40 more people with high-powered automatic weapons sitting by guard in the air and the ground to make sure nobody approaches you.
Officially, the Colombian government is cooperating with the U.S. to stop the traffic. But people who have been there wonder about that. Who are the people with the automatic weapons?
They appear to be military. They have military uniforms and stuff on.
You wouldn't be surprised to find out troops were involved.
No, I wouldn't.
Anyone we talked with agreed that the only surefire way to stop the traffic is at the source. But it's not that easy. It's guessed that $600 million American dollars go into the Colombian economy every year from marijuana alone. So, it would seem the only semi-effective way to stem the flow is to catch the big motherships out at sea before they can offload the dope to smaller boats. That job falls mainly to the Coast Guard. That's the Coast Guard cutter Diligence down there, shadowing a ship that was bound from Colombia to somewhere. Immediately visible are a crew of 13 Colombian nationals and 2 goats, whose role in this caper we never did figure out. The Colombians have told the Coast Guard that their holds are full of marine equipment, but the captain of the Diligence, James Billingham, suspects otherwise.
We initially noticed them underway with all their running lights on. Later on, we observed them turning out their running lights, coming in closer to the beach, and eventually rendezvousing with the smaller boat. All of these things are typical of a profile that we see with drug traffickers.
But they were in international waters, and because of the claim of British registry, the American and British State Departments had to be called in. The Diligence laid off, waiting for permission to board for a second night into a second day.
Ok, ya entendemos. Si ustedes nos siguen por
The Coast Guard hoped the Colombians would voluntarily follow them into American waters. Then they could legally board. But the Colombians were having none of that. So the waiting game continued. The Coast Guard's chances rested on one of three things: that the Gulf Stream would drift them into territorial waters, that a blistering sun would make the Colombians uncomfortable enough to get the inevitable over with, or that the State Department would come through.
We have authorization to board your vessel.
Their break finally came from Washington. At the end of the third day, the Diligence was allowed to board, but only to check for proof of registry. The boarding party found no documents that would prove British registry, so the Coast Guard was able to make its decisive move in this game of maritime chess. They could look for the registry number on the main beam of the ship, which meant that they had to go into the holds.
Boarding party, this is Diligence. Understand there's a large quantity of bales obstructing the number?
That's a Charlie.
Boarding party, are these bales of marine supplies or of a green leafy matter?
Test is positive for THC.
The marine equipment turned out to be 50 tons of marijuana. So the game was over. The ship, which had been detained, was now seized. The Colombians were arrested and taken aboard the Diligence. Some of them were familiar faces. They'd been through it all before. And to sum up, on this one caper, the Coast Guard got its quarry. They'll fly their marijuana flag into the Miami station and add a hash mark to indicate another kill. The Immigration Service will get 13 Colombians. Turns out 6 of them are repeaters. Because they were arrested on the high seas and prosecution is almost impossible, they will be detained briefly, then put on an airplane for Colombia. Tickets paid for by the United States government. And customs? They get a slightly used 150-foot freighter and 50 tons of marijuana to burn. If I got excited by all this big money and decided to run a load of marijuana up from Colombia, what would my chances be of getting caught?
You know, we'd like to think differently, but apparently the risks are low. We feel we could be more effective if we could raise that risk and have some type of deterrent on a person getting into the business. But as activity continually increases, we have to assume that the risk is not that great.
The risk, as near as we could tell, is about 1 chance in 20 of getting caught. So, while you're watching 50 tons of marijuana on its way to destruction here, remember that another 1,000 tons would have made it through. That's 1,000 tons, 2 million pounds, 32 million baggy-sized ounces on its way to the neighborhood pushers of America. Our story seemed to have some effect. Since it aired, the Drug Enforcement Agency has opened 2 new offices in South Florida and added 15 more agents to the area. And the new governor of Florida, Bob Graham, proposed and got passed some tough new smuggling laws, possibly because of our story, possibly because on the very weekend it aired, some smugglers used a farm owned by the governor to land this plane loaded with marijuana. The new law provides mandatory minimum sentences and fines. So these days in Florida, if you get caught with from 100 pounds to a ton of marijuana, you must serve 3 years and pay $25,000. From a ton to 5 tons, it's 5 years and $50,000. Anything over 5 tons is 15 years and $200,000. All of the above applies, of course, if you get caught.